Welcome to the first Chrysalis Conversations event of 2020, our live broadcast of an amazing and educational discussion entitled The Promise of Persistence. I'm Alex Sachs of KCCI 8 News, and on behalf of the Chrysalis Foundation, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Chrysalis is proud to partner with the League of Women Voters of Metro Des Moines in presenting the 2020 Chrysalis Conversations series. 2020 is a special year, not because of the new normal in our lives caused by the pandemic, but because 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of women achieving the right to vote, a right known as suffrage, when the 19th Amendment became part of the United States Constitution. It's been more than 170 years since the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The convention launched a protracted and embattled journey to expand the rights of American women, including what is known as suffrage. Suffrage is defined as the right to vote in political elections. Over the years, women known as suffragists used many tactics, including protests, civil disobedience, and boycotts in their efforts, and then endured fierce measures to suppress them, ranging from imprisonment, force feeding, to arson, even bombings. After decades of struggle, both for and against women's suffrage, Congress passed the 19th Amendment in August of 1919. The amendment required ratification by 36 states before it was included in the United States Constitution. On July 2nd, 1919, the Iowa legislature voted to ratify the amendment, and by August of 1920, the 19th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. Today, we'll hear from two experts about women's journey to suffrage, and I am certain you will be inspired as you learn of the strength, fortitude, and persistence of women involved. I'll turn to Terry Hernandez, Executive Director for Chrysalis, to lead today's conversation. Terry?
Thank you, Alex, and welcome to all of you. We're thrilled to have you here virtually, enjoying a new format for Chrysalis Conversations, but the conversation is equally vital. We do have two experts with us, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce them to you. First, State Representative Ruth Ann Gaines, who serves Iowa's 32nd District, which includes much of Greater Des Moines. Ruth Ann was born and raised in Des Moines and graduated from St. Joseph's Academy. She holds a bachelor's degree in drama and speech from Clark College and a master's degree in dramatic arts from the University of California, Santa Barbara. One thing to know about Representative Gaines is in 1998, she was named the National Teacher of the Year and received the award from President Bill Clinton. She is currently an adjunct professor for Des Moines Area Community College. Thank you for being with us today. Dr. Karen Leroux teaches United States history at Drake University, specializing in the 19th and early 20th centuries. She explores how race, gender, and class have shaped modern history. She focuses on women, work, and education, and published her research in national and international journals. Born in Canada, Dr. Leroux earned a bachelor's degree at Northwestern University, a master's degree at the University of British Columbia, and a PhD at Northwestern. She's taught at Drake for 15 years and has returned from what was to have been a sabbatical to join us today. You'll understand why these women are experts in their fields as we begin our conversation. As Alex Sachs explained and gave a brief overview of the struggle experienced by women in the pursuit of the vote, I'm going to pose the first question to our speakers. What did passage of the 19th Amendment achieve, and why was it so important to women, Dr. Leroux?
Okay. The 19th Amendment was incredibly important, not just to women, but I think to Americans, because it represents the largest single extension of voter rights in U.S. history. That's a big deal. It involved several generations of women, and it involved multiple groups of women. Some scholars suggest that we think about the suffrage movement as many movements. We'll probably get to talk about that some. They also overcame a wide range of opponents. We'll talk about that, I think. And And while it was admittedly a piecemeal movement, it took a long time, it happened very gradually, it wasn't an overnight sort of victory. That's one of the things people don't know about it. And maybe the other thing that I should acknowledge right off the bat is that despite being the largest single expansion of voter rights, it was also a very imperfect movement in a lot of ways. And I think Ruth Ann can add to that in several ways.
I like the way you said that it was many movements all in one, because as we look at any movement in this country for equal rights or civil rights, it includes many groups. And there were many African American women who worked for women's suffrage. Unfortunately, with the Women's Rights Amendment, it did not include African American women in the South. Many of those women had been disenfranchised since slavery. And while they were working for their own civil rights as black women, they also wanted the right to vote. So black women in the South were still disenfranchised with the right to vote. And in certain cases, they were left out of the big movement because white women feared that they would threaten their white supremacy and other rights that they had as white women. And still, slavery in some cases was still a part of it.
Difficult years, weren't they?
They really were.
So we heard about the long, protracted process to achieve suffrage. Why did this take so long, Dr. Leroux? Why did we spend so many years and decades to get there?
It does look like an eternity sometimes, and certainly when I'm teaching students and they look at the founding of the nation and the ideals represented in the Declaration of Independence, and they look at 1920, they see this massive amount of time. I could probably spend a lot of time answering that question, but I'm going to try to sort of sharpen it up a little bit and just give you a few of the main reasons why it took so long. The forces of opposition were strong. Now, that's kind of like an umbrella problem. The forces of opposition to women's suffrage were great. One of the obstacles was the legal doctrine of coverture. And this was a legal doctrine that was brought over by British colonists from England. Coverture held that women, once they got married, they were under the wing protection and cover of their husbands. They had no separate identity from their husbands, no separate legal existence from their husbands. That takes, I mean, it's a really different world, first of all. And I got to add to that, because of coverture, women were said to be virtually represented by their husbands in the polity. The husband was the one. The wife was subsumed within the husband. So that's one of the reasons that it takes so long, because that legal tradition needs to be overcome. And American lawyers are still using treatises in the 1860s and the 1870s that continue to embrace and outline coverture.
Women were property of their husbands and couldn't make their own decisions.
In a sense. I don't want to say property as in chattel, but they were not their own person. That's probably a better way to put it. Another reason why it took so long, politics were not very civil or peaceful in the 19th century. I think a lot of us have some issues about politics today not being civil enough. Well, in the 19th century, the political arena was really quite well, they used the words a rough and tumble environment. It was a violent environment. There's evidence for that in paintings by George Caleb, wait a minute, am I going to get right? George Caleb Loring, I think it's, no, Bingham. He painted a painting of a county election. And you can see drunken men in this, at the courthouse, voting.
We have plenty of evidence of violence in the Senate. People pulling guns on one another. It wasn't a woman's place to be in the Senate or in the legislature like you.
Right, right.
A couple of other reasons I have to add. There were a lot of anti-suffrage men and women, anti-suffrage women, who thought that women voting would violate traditional gender norms and possibly threaten the institution of the family. And the last reason that I want to bring out in thinking about why suffrage took so long, women's suffrage often got associated with other movements that were stigmatized at the time. Before the Civil War, one of the movements that women's suffrage got associated with was anti-slavery. It was a minority movement before the Civil War. It was a reviled movement before the Civil War. Also, women's suffrage got associated with temperance and prohibition, anti-prostitution. If you think about the theme across those three, those were all movements that challenged men's liberty. Challenged men's liberty to hold slaves, to drink, which was often associated with violence against women at the time, and to use prostitutes. After the Civil War, women's suffrage gets linked up with issues like polygamy because of Utah passing suffrage earlier than most other states. It gets linked up with the free love movement, which actually has ramifications in Iowa. Free love being something not about orgies, but free love was actually about choosing who you loved and being able to not continue to love that person, maybe get a divorce. And it also gets linked up with white supremacy.
Very convoluted.
Yeah, which if you watch the video that premiered last week on Carrie Chapman Catt, you might have noticed how the producers emphasized Catt's insistence on a single issue of suffrage, fighting for suffrage. What I just outlined might give you some understanding of why she was so adamant about a single issue movement. She was really on guard against getting linked up with some of those movements that could bring the cause down, inspire opposition.
Wow.
I would say that unfortunately, Black women and white women have not traditionally been able to work together in one single movement, as Carrie Chapman Catt so wanted. When we look back in history, Black women did not necessarily align with white women because of white supremacy, because of marriage. Many Black women were never able to get married, and from zero on were head of household. And so they already were working. Some of the reasons why women wanted suffrage, it was not just for suffrage, but for freedom in every area, and that was to be able to work. Black women always worked. They knew what that meant, so they didn't see themselves as a part of the white woman's movement. So their goal to achieve the right to vote, again, as I said earlier, was entwined with human rights as a Black person. And as we look at some of those leaders in the past, we see that they talked about civil rights more than women's rights. And they thought it was two different movements, although now, as we look back, we can see that they were very much in line with each other.
Fascinating.
If I can expand on that, like
Yes.
what Ruth Ann's just described is very representative of the relations between women's suffrage and white supremacy, for lack of a better word. In the post-Civil War era, during Carrie Chapman Catt's period of time, when Jim Crow was at its height and white women suffragists and African American women suffragists had a really tense and troubled relationship because they didn't know how to move forward. There was a window of opportunity. There was one moment, about 30 years maybe, where African American women and white women aligned in the abolitionist movement before slavery ended, and then during the Civil War up until about 1869. In the late 1860s, during the fight for the 15th Amendment, which enfranchised African American men, there was an organization, a really inspiring organization, called the American Equal Rights Association. And it was a mixed race, mixed gender association. It included people like Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Lucretia Mott. And there was this brief period of time when they were working for universal suffrage, but that fell apart after the 15th Amendment.
Sadly.
It wasn't successful. They tried.
We watched the movie, and we'll be seeing the movie about Carrie Chapman Catt, Iowan.
Yes.
And there were several champions from Iowa, but several champions that we maybe don't know about. Are there some other suffrage champions that we should understand the history about?
Shall I start?
We
Go
can.
ahead.
Okay.
Please.
Well, I have to just reiterate, Carrie Chapman Catt in that video, and I really did like that video in a number of ways. It was, I thought it was really interesting to see some historians disagree about Carrie Chapman Catt's legacy. I thought it was really interesting to see the extent to which the producers really emphasized contingency. The contingencies of history, the things that we can't anticipate are going to happen. And the particular context of Jim Crow that Carrie Chapman Catt worked within. The video really emphasized her as a political strategist, and that is what a lot of historians remember her for. She understood in fighting for women's suffrage that the people she had to convince were people in power, white men. Those were the people she thought she needed to keep on side. Now, because of that choice, she made some morally fraught decisions. But that was who she was. Carrie Chapman Catt, the other really famous Iowa suffragist was Annie Savory. She was a leader in Des Moines. And she was a leader who saw debates over free love derail women's suffrage efforts in Iowa. That idea that women should be able to have the right to divorce and be able to love more than one person in their lifetime became really contentious. And she watched that undermine the case for women's suffrage in Iowa. A third Iowan that I'll just give a quick shout out to. People don't know who she is. Julia Addington. Actually, I can't really say that she was a suffragist, but Julia Addington was the first woman to hold an elected position in Iowa. She was the county superintendent of schools. I think it was of Mitchell County. It was in the east. It was 1868 when she became county superintendent of schools. She couldn't vote for herself, but she could hold office. That's how complicated suffrage laws were. Last person that I'll mention, who I think is a really interesting suffragist for us all to understand, is Alice Paul. And I think Alice Paul came up in the Carrie Chapman Catt video that Iowa Public Television aired last week, because she and Carrie Chapman Catt did not see eye to eye. They were actually they were kind of thorns in each other's side in a lot of ways. Alice Paul was a young woman suffragist, a leader who was really confrontational, as opposed to the kind of accommodationist strategies that Carrie Chapman Catt used. Alice Paul was behind all of the picketing at the White House, acts of civil disobedience. She had been in England and trained with the Pankhursts in the English women's suffrage movement. When she was imprisoned for picketing, she called herself a political prisoner of the United States. She was a political prisoner for having spoken out, for dissenting. And she wanted to make people see that. She led a hunger strike. She was force-fed. She was an awesome martyr for the cause in a lot of ways. But I also want to acknowledge that she was a young woman in the movement who injected a lot of enthusiasm and excitement into the movement. She led some of the most important parades for women's suffrage. And one of those parades, she made the very hard to grapple with decision, a very difficult decision, to ask the Illinois delegation to have the black leaders walk at the back of the parade. Like Carrie Chapman Catt in this instance, she decided it was more important to keep the Southerners on side, and she deferred to white supremacy in that parade. This is one woman I'm talking about who defines herself as a political prisoner, who is such a martyr for the cause, so confrontational, but then at a clutch moment, she made a decision that I think a lot of women's suffragists and women's rights advocates today really regret and
Very divisive.
try hard to understand. You know, try really hard to understand why she would do that. I will say that there's some evidence that members of the Illinois delegation, white members of the Illinois delegation, reached out to Ida B. Wells, who was the leader of the black women's suffrage organization, the Alpha Suffrage Club, and asked her to join them as they passed. Demonstrating, you know, all white suffragists did not think the same way.
Interesting.
I'm glad that you mentioned Ida B. Wells. Unfortunately,
She's so important.
Terry, there are not historically many black women in Iowa who we can name who were a part, you know, of the women's movement. Although there were many women, black and white, members of the Unitarian Church who were members of this movement, one being Susan B. Anthony, who really wanted to struggle for white women as well as black women. Later on, when we talk about this, I want to talk about another African-American woman who was Unitarian, and that's Edna Griffin. But I'll bring that up later in the conversation. But there's another person or two that I'd like to mention. You mentioned earlier that there were men also involved in the movement, and one such person was Frederick Douglass, whom we all probably know about in his leadership of men in the United States and what he did for African Americans, but he was also a part of the women's movement and attended a lot of the women's conventions. He also worked a lot with Ida B. Wells, not only in fighting for women's rights, but in many of his writings for African American women. And so that's a big name. So I'd say Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, and Susan B. Anthony are three names that we should historically note for their work in the women's movement.
Interesting that Frederick Douglass would have been involved, would have been considered today as a feminist,
Yes.
but really was behind the cause for equal rights for all.
Well, in his day, Frederick Douglass supported many, many women. There was recently a story about Madam C.J. Walker, the woman who founded the hair care products for African American women back in the early 1900s, and Frederick Douglass was one of her major supporters. So he was an advocate of realizing that women's experiences were different than men's experiences in the movement, and he wanted to give women their rights. But I also have to say that men still, even though they were in the women's movement, they wanted to hold their own. They still wanted to be men. They didn't want to give anything up. So it was still harder for women.
Still quite divisive.
Still harder for women.
Such entanglement of all of those issues
I know.
became difficult.
I know, really.
And so we look to today and the applications to today, and it would seem to me that there are remnants of this struggle that have persisted and that are evident today. Could you expand on that a little bit, Dr. Leroux?
Well, I think the most evident one for me today is really the troubled relationship between the federal government and state governments. Given what we are experiencing right now with COVID-19 and the response to that, we're seeing the struggle between what are states responsible for and what is the federal government responsible for. And you know, right off the bat, one of the things that we talked about was how the 19th Amendment did not do all that it could have for some African American women, especially those in the South. States continue to use the same strategies that they used to disenfranchise African American men after the 15th Amendment was passed. They continue to use them in many cases with black women. So poll taxes, literacy tests, voter intimidation, all of those sorts of things were utilized. States basically were able to circumvent the federal law. And so, you know, that's echoes with today.
Interesting.
In different ways, but just the tension between what is the federal government responsible for and how much do they control. At the time, voter qualifications were determined by the states.
Interesting.
I would like to,
Yeah,
I didn't
go
want to
ahead.
interrupt you,
No,
but I'd like
do.
to mention a current experience that I've had in the Iowa legislature.
Yes.
And this happened this year in 2020 before we were sent home because of the COVID virus. We were trying to write a resolution celebrating this year, 2020, but we wanted to include in the resolution that many African American women did not receive the right to vote until 1965 with the Voter Rights Act. And that was just one little clause that we wanted to add to this proclamation. And there was a group in Iowa City, a women's group, who fought us tooth and nail about putting that clause into the proclamation. They wanted the proclamation to simply state that it's the 100-year anniversary of women's suffrage, and that's it. And I look at that, again, as a form of white supremacy, because it's a fact. It's in the history books that in 1965, the Voter Rights Act was passed to alleviate some of those issues that you talked about, gerrymandering, other things that prevent people from voting, voter suppression, which we still have in some states around the country, and the difference between federal control and local control. That was what that law was all about. And still in 2020, there was a white women's group who did not want to acknowledge the passage of that. Probably the most important legislative act, I would think, in our history, because it determined a relationship between the federal government and state government. So it's still there. We're still fighting.
Isn't it fascinating that for many of us, we don't realize that there was a 45-year gap between white women being allowed to vote and then African American women really being written into the Constitution.
Yeah, African American women in the South.
In the South, right.
Have it.
Right.
Yeah.
It was the southern states.
So it could be that maybe
that.
because it was the South and we are in Iowa, that people in Iowa City didn't see the importance of mentioning that.
I see.
That could have been the reason, but it wasn't a very good reason.
But
It should have been a part of it.
But still, there were repercussions across the nation.
And there still are.
And the Voting Rights Act, really, it's like in 1965, it's making the promise of the 19th Amendment more solid, more real. Yeah.
Probably the most important piece of legislation that Lyndon B. Johnson, I think, signed into law. So.
Do you think because of the continued strife between federal government and state government that we're going to be continuing this back and forth with decisions on voter rights and voter suppression, et cetera?
I do. I do. It still continues. We have a new Voter Rights Act here in the state of Iowa in 2017, which some of us as legislators feel that it suppresses minority groups and other disenfranchised groups, and yet that bill passed.
Interesting.
Yeah.
2017.
So after these decades, we continue.
There's another issue in the news today that traces its roots to this period as well, and that's the ERA. And it actually does go back to your question as well about the relationship between states and federal government. We still don't have an ERA, an Equal Rights Amendment. The 19th Amendment did not give women equal rights. It gave women, it denied discrimination on the basis of sex just in terms of voting rights. It was only 4 years later, in 1923, that Alice Paul and the National Women's Party proposed the first Equal Rights Amendment, because they recognized so quickly that voting rights was only a part of the puzzle. It didn't do anything for employment equity. It didn't do anything about marital equity. It didn't do anything about social equality in a lot of other ways. They start to bring out an Equal Rights Amendment. 1923 was the first time they tried to pass it. 1970s, tried to ratify it.
Yeah.
And now there are some states that didn't ratify it that are trying to ratify it after the deadline.
Oh my.
So, you know, I think that it definitely is a remnant of the struggle that's really active today and may get reopened.
I think the 1970s once again highlighted the difference between African American women. Now we're into the stage where we call ourselves African American women,
Yes.
and white women, but there were some black women who were involved in the ERA movement, the Equal Rights Amendment movement of the 70s. And so as we come along in history, we can see more black women getting involved and more black women coming on board. And that is because we are gradually, decade after decade, seeing more civil rights. And as we, as a nation of people, expand our own civil rights, we can have the freedom to align with white people and their groups. So as history, you asked earlier, why has it taken so long? It takes a long time, I think, for groups to align. The passage of legislation does not necessarily change minds, changes behavior, but not the way people think. And that takes generations. And so that's why we're still working toward it.
Important to remember. And you brought up the Equal Rights Amendment. I think now there is a new movie.
There is.
About a leader of against the Equal Rights Amendment.
Phyllis Schlafly.
Phyllis Schlafly. And so it brings to mind that back in the late 60s and 70s, when the feminist movement was beginning to push, and there was a little bit of unity. There was Shirley Chisholm, there was Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, and all of the leaders of the movement. And then you have Phyllis Schlafly, who is tremendously resistant, somewhat starting the moral majority. Would that have been true as far as her place?
I would think so. She's very strong, very intelligent woman, but did not see the point in women having equal rights because she felt that women would lose something. And I think that that is always a problem with give and take, whether we're talking about voting rights, civil rights, or human rights. Certain groups, well, all groups have to give up something in order for us to become closer together. And Phyllis Schlafly didn't want to give up anything.
Almost the same tones that were taken in the early days of suffrage. You know, giving up the white supremacy, giving up the husband's position in the home. Does it seem to be somewhat resonant to you?
It rhymes. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think people attribute that to Mark Twain or someone like that. You know, those fears of loss are real.
Oh, yeah.
Those fears that progressive social change will undermine what's comfortable and what's known, and what may work for some people. You know, change is threatening.
It really is.
I don't, you know, although I'm no fan of the anti-movements, I'm not a fan of Phyllis Schlafly, but I don't find her emergence or any other anti's emergence particularly distressing. I think it's a sign of progress. You know, it's a sign of progress when people emerge to stand up against your movement, when there's backlash. History doesn't tend to move in a kind of steady stream of progress. We'd like to believe that. I think it's really comforting. It's kind of a narrative we tell ourselves, it's going to get better. But usually it gets better in fits and starts, and things get worse before they get better. When I see backlash, it suggests to me that somebody pushed the right button.
I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah, and so the emergence of somebody like Phyllis Schlafly, the emergence of some of the backlash that, you know, young women may find really frustrating today in the public arena, read it as a sign of how much progress we have made, that somebody's getting anxious about too much change too fast. Take it as a sign that you can go forward. You know, like, thrive on it. Don't let it stop you.
I think, and you know, and I hadn't really thought of this until you mentioned it, but I agree with you in that a person like Phyllis Schlafly forces the powers that be to take a stand. You know, like, put your money where your mouth is.
Yes.
Because so many people can give a movement lip service until they are put in a position to actually do something about it. You know, another example in the Iowa legislature recently, although it didn't have anything to do with women's rights, but it did have to do with a civil rights issue. And I noticed that even in my own caucus, people were afraid to vote for it, even though they knew it was right. I won't give too many specifics, but they didn't want to vote for it because they were afraid of what they would lose. They were afraid of what people would think of them. And so it took 2 or 3 days and one long night to get everybody to get out there crying and to get on board.
Interesting.
That's why movements take so long. Doing the right thing is difficult.
Very much.
One last thing about Phyllis Schlafly you made me think of. It bears noting that some of her prescriptions for women of supporting the traditional household, subordinating oneself to one's family, were not things that she did herself.
Right.
She was publicly active. She was very ambitious. She did not subordinate herself too much. Doing a little critical thinking about those actors who advise us to do one thing, look and see if they're actually doing what they say that other women should do. It might tell us something about the dissonance between their deeds and their actions. Might tell us something that we need to pay attention to.
Good point.
We never even planned to talk about Phyllis Schlafly.
Interesting, the ramifications of those actions. You know what this reminds me of? For those of you that were fans of Chrysalis founder Louise Noun, she wrote a number of books about strong-minded women, more strong-minded women. She published a book about Annie Savory, you know, weighing, was she a leader, was she a pariah? You know, you can look at both sides of it, and I think she presented those perspectives very objectively. But what we learn is that there have been throughout history a number of very strong women, and for whatever reasons, particularly in the suffrage movement, they had to make very difficult decisions, as you talked about, Ruth Ann, and as we've learned that Sometimes you had to let go of some of those pieces of what you hoped to happen in order for what they might assume to be the larger.
Everything is very political to me.
Yes.
Maybe because I'm now sitting in the Iowa legislature, but in making change and even voting for change, you need to weigh what's the greatest good. It's always about what's the greatest good. And sometimes that's very difficult. It's very difficult to take a stand. It's very difficult.
Certainly.
But everything is political, like a chess game, and moving things around to make things right for the greater good.
Certainly one of the very strong lessons that we've learned from the suffrage movement. So as we think about other things to draw from what we've learned and from our history and from the activities and power that women have exhibited, what are the lessons for today that we can use? How do we bring people into this conversation? How do we bring men, people of color, women who may have agreed with Phyllis Schlafly that women have a place? How do we bring people into this discussion to understand the true nature of this work and why it's so important, and then equally why it's so important to exercise that power to vote?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I participated in a workshop in the 1980s. I had not been really involved with the women's movement of the 70s per se, because I saw it as a white women's movement, and I didn't see my place in it. I thought that if I received equal rights as a woman, as a black woman, then I'd have everything, not realizing it. But there was a series of workshops between white women in the community and black women in the community. And there was a board, you know, it was before technology, so there were two blackboards, and whoever the facilitator was began to list the needs of women, and we began to see that we were a lot more similar than we ever thought we would. There needs to be a lot more dialogue between diverse women so that we don't threaten each other. I think certain groups of women threaten other groups of women, so then it becomes another type of battle. We need to get rid of that. I really think that. I really believe that.
And it's a perceived threat.
Definitely.
Believe, as
and
opposed
sometimes
to...
it's cultural. But I think in women coming together, we can break down cultural barriers in order to work together to achieve equal rights for women, especially in the workplace.
It's a strength women have, they say, isn't it?
It is.
Very much.
Yeah. Thinking, Ruth Ann, about the way you described your interpretation of the women's movement when you were younger as a white woman's movement.
Yes.
It's one of the reasons I think it's so important that we recognize, just like in the suffrage movement, they needed multiple leaders. They didn't need one leader, they needed multiple leaders. In the women's movement today, we need multiple leaders, and we need to support and nurture multiple leaders. People like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, I said earlier, they didn't see eye to eye. They didn't agree with one another. They had different strategies. They had a similar end goal, but they had very different strategies. They had different constituencies. They had different organizations. Likewise, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, they had different constituencies as well. But if we nurture many leaders, women don't have to all agree on every single thing, but they can figure out what's important to agree on. You know, I often say to my students, isn't it interesting that we expect women to all agree? We expect the African American community to be one and all agree, but we don't expect men to agree. We don't expect white men to agree. They're allowed to have political differences. But we expect that women will all align together. We expect that the African American community will all be of one mind. The same thing with the Latinx community, the Native American community. We expect that. I don't think it's a realistic expectation. I think it's asking too much of minority movements to expect them to find consensus constantly. But they can work together to figure out what are the important issues and try to come together with in coalitions to get at the important issues. It's okay if we don't agree on every single thing.
And that's a growth that has to come from within. Within these groups that have these movements seeking equality, we do have a lot of dissension. But underlying that needs to be respect. Respect for differences within our own group.
And
realizing that we are diverse and we don't have to be alike in everything in order to achieve what we want for everyone. It's just going to take still some time.
Yeah.
This is why it's so slow.
A work in progress.
So it's a work in progress.
I think that's why we talk about equity versus equality. You know, it's about everyone having the same opportunity and the same potential.
Yes.
As opposed to giving everyone the same
opportunities for growth.
Right.
Opportunities for change.
Very good point. Very good point. Yeah. You mentioned Representative Gaines, Edna Griffin, and I wanted to give you a chance if you...
Well, as I was thinking about today and trying to think of women in my own lifetime who I felt had more than one message, she came to mind because I know that people think of her as the Rosa Parks of Des Moines because of her work at Katz Drugstore and integrating. But she also was a strong women leader and was a part of the women's movement here in Des Moines through her work in the church. And I think she needs to be recognized for that. She was a very outgoing, diverse woman who saw the needs of women being represented in every walk of life. And many of her meetings in her home and in her church were about women, women's rights. She worked for various groups and their rights, and we don't often mention Edna Griffin when we talk about women's suffrage. But she was a
very much
a part of the suffrage movement, and so I wanted to give her credit today.
Thank you for doing so. Many of us don't recognize the history we have right here in the Des Moines area. Fascinating. What are some other thoughts that you'd like to share with us that perhaps we haven't discussed related to the movement, the politic, the current environment? Anything else that might come to mind that we might like to share with people as we think about suffrage and then now the importance of the vote, the importance of being active?
It bothers me that many young men and women don't realize the power of the vote. We've talked here today about women and how women have fought for centuries. We've talked about African Americans specifically, but other groups of color who have fought for various rights, one being the right to vote, the right to exercise their ideas and goals. And I see a lot of young people who don't recognize the power of the vote, and they don't vote. So I think I would like to encourage young people, especially those who will be 18 by the time we can vote, to register and vote, because it is a part of the political process, and it's a part of being a good citizen. It's a part of being an educated person. We must vote.
A lot of strife went into that right.
People have died for the right to vote. People need to look up Bloody Sunday. People need to see the movie Selma to realize parts of the struggle. And it's a large struggle.
Showing up to vote also is a part of maintaining our democracy. You know, showing up to vote, making sure that the voting places are safe, respectful, well-regulated, ensures a peaceful transition of power,
Yes, that's good.
participating by
Yes.
showing up. If you don't show up, you're not participating in maintaining that democracy.
Good point.
I think it's been fascinating to see the ramifications of the vote. So I think back in my lifetime, probably most recently, to the Women's March
Oh, yes.
and the reflection of perhaps women's frustration with the results of voting. But that you mentioned Selma and the strife to be able to vote and to be
Yes.
able to exercise freedom. So there's so much at stake. I think those are truly very, very important points and take a lot of time.
I think it's important for young people to realize that by voting, they become a part of something.
Yes.
Something bigger than you and I.
Yes.
And that's beautiful.
Yes. It was racial politics then. It has been racial politics, gender politics, all of those factors have been at play, I think, throughout the struggle for our country, but throughout the world.
Yeah.
So the lessons we can bring forward are that the struggles will continue. We need to be open, we need to listen, we need to be aware of what's going on and be a part of the conversation.
Participate.
And take advantage of the moment too. Like you just mentioned the Women's March, and my mind went to the rapidity with which the Me Too movement blossomed afterwards. Who would have recognized that? Women have been complaining about workplace harassment for over 100 years, but we had a significant shift in the last couple of years. No one could have predicted that 10 years ago, that suddenly there would be this interest. There's a wonderful historian of slavery, Barbara J. Fields, and I'm going to paraphrase her. She said something to the effect of, war has a way of making the scandalous respectable. War has a way of making the scandalous respectable. I'd like to broaden out to not just war, but any kind of cataclysmic moment, any kind of really big upheaval in society has a way of making what was unthinkable thinkable. She was referring to the emancipation of slaves. In 1859, most Americans would never have thought emancipation, the way it took place, was possible within the next few years. By 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued, and it is an issue, it is a subject in motion. It is a movement in motion. About 3 years.
Pretty remarkable.
I think taking advantage of the moment, recognizing this is a moment of potential change.
We never know when that may happen.
It's happening now.
Yes.
It's happening now,
Well,
living through this pandemic. This is change. This is revolution. We will no longer see life the way we saw it.
Yeah.
This is big.
It's a pretty fascinating perspective, isn't it?
It is, and we need to take advantage of it.
We can
And
learn
make the
so
most.
much.
We can learn so much.
Yes, I think what this has told us is we've learned so much from the work, the strife, the blood, sweat, and tears that have gone into these movements, particularly the right to vote. And I know you've covered some wonderful pieces of the conversation and a lot of the history. Let's look to see what questions we might have from those who are observing.
Okay.
One question is, how can we connect history that rhymes with the work Chrysalis does today? So we talked about history that rhymes. I think that was your comment.
Yeah, and I mean, basically what I was suggesting is simply that, history doesn't repeat itself. We aren't in Groundhog Day and it's all like just happening over and over again. But there are echoes in history. certainly some of the work with Chrysalis having to do with supporting women and girls in the community is something that connects back to the progressive era and efforts to try to nurture, protect and nurture immigrant women during the waves of immigration at the end of the 19th century. We're now in a period that's post-1965 immigration, creating opportunities. For
Always
women.
opportunity.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not sure. You're probably the person best positioned to answer
Yeah, that's what I
what
thought.
Chrysalis is doing.
Well, you know,
That has those
I
echoes.
think part of what we recognize, and thanks to our founders who were legislators, who were attorneys, who were passionate philanthropists like Louise Noun, who recognized that there was a disparity and then began to just push to make things happen. And I think we've learned that that's how suffrage came about. It was the momentum of groups of people that had some commonality, some common thought, collective cause for a common issue. And that, for us, is the work of Chrysalis. We have always believed that it's important that particularly girls and women have opportunities to make choices and to be presented, as you said, Ruth Ann, with the opportunities, because sometimes they aren't evident and they're not there. So our work is to be sure that there's a broader understanding of where those inequities are, trying to level the playing field, and then helping women and girls open the doors to those opportunities. And that's been the work that Chrysalis has been about for 31 years and probably will be on for many years to come.
I know that Chrysalis empowers young women in leadership positions.
Yes.
And I think that is very, very good, because as we progress on in history, women need to feel that they can take on more leadership abilities and balance a family. That's been one of the bigger stumbling blocks, I think, with women in leadership positions. They feel they can't do it and manage a family, but we are seeing more and more that that is a possibility. There is potential there.
Well,
and
you are.
I'm proud to say that in the Democratic caucus, there are half women, 21 women, I think.
Wonderful.
So about half of us, a little less than half of us, are women. So we are trying to do the job of empowerment. And I would like to see more men come on board with that, not be afraid that they're going to lose something by getting women out to take on strong leadership positions, because I think the world would be different. Society would be different. Our organizations would be different being led by women.
I agree. And you mentioned men. So we talked about Frederick Douglass. We're talking now about other women's movements. What men come to mind when you think about the men that have been part of moving women forward and pushing women towards success? Are there men in your lives that have resonated, that have carried the message and helped promote women along the way? Can you?
This is very personal, but I don't know why, since I've had this time to think, I have recorded mentally the people in my life who have pushed me forward. The majority have been white men.
Interesting.
And I've thought, probably because they didn't see me as a threat. They saw potential, but they didn't see me taking their jobs.
Oh.
And I think that more men need to step up, but also not see anyone as a threat. But that's kind of, I've lived here in Iowa. I've done my work in Iowa, but it hasn't been Iowa women. It's been white men in strong positions who have pulled me up and pulled me forward, with a couple exceptions.
Fascinating.
That was just a personal note.
Fascinating. Are there
That
some?
might also have something to do with the dynamics of their power,
Yes.
and that they could use their power for good.
Yes.
My identity as a historian is is clearly, blatantly evident in that every man that I think of is a 19th century man. A friend of mine wrote a book that was called Parker Pillsbury, Male Feminist. He was a minister who was active in the abolition movement. There were a lot of men who were active in the abolition movement who were supportive of women's rights, who recognized that women needed rights in order to advocate on behalf of the slave, that women started to recognize their own disabilities in public life because when they tried to speak out publicly, they were silenced. Yeah, most of the men that I think of are 19th century men. I don't know what that says.
Interesting.
That is interesting.
But that's.
Well, if we could send a message today to women
Yes.
about recognizing and using their power, which is what Chrysalis works to do, as you mentioned and as you know, what would be some of those messages that we can draw from our discussion today that would suggest that women can take the lead and they can step into the spotlight and begin to have a voice in the decisions around their own lives?
Well, thinking about what Ruth Ann said, developing a network, identifying your allies so that they lift you up.
Yes.
Because invariably there are going to be struggles and there are going to be failures. The suffrage movement had 100 years of failures, just about, until they succeeded. And they succeed by a very small margin, ultimately.
Right.
It comes down to Tennessee. Yeah, identify your network, identify your allies, be prepared for failures. You will succeed.
Be comfortable with failures.
Yeah.
It certainly takes, you can look at history to say it takes sometimes multiple failures, but eventually you will succeed.
And we don't look at them. A lot of times when we teach history, we teach about the victories. We don't teach about the failures.
It's true.
It's true.
And the struggle is part of the victory. So, yeah.
I think we heard that today in when you were explaining about your runs for office or different elected positions.
How I'd lost twice before I ran. And I felt, whether or not it's true, that part of it was that I was a woman, and secondly, African American, that I had to work a little bit harder, but I still did it.
Yeah.
It took a lot of time.
What was it about you that drove you to get there? What was it that
I
made
felt
you
that
see?
I was a leader. I could be strong, and that people could depend on me, that I could make good decisions. And I believe that once people had the opportunity to meet me and know me, they wouldn't care who I was, what color I was, or what gender I was. They would want to vote for me, and eventually that happened. By the time I ran the last time, my gender or my race didn't make a difference. First couple times it did. Second, third time, people didn't care. I never heard anything about being a woman. I never heard anything about being African American. Who I was stood out.
Yeah.
But it took that long for me to build that reputation, and that was work.
Yeah. And who you were was informed by your perspective as a woman of color too. And that was important. That's what part of what I hear coming through when you speak of that. It's not that you ignored your identity or put it aside. You had faith that your identity was one that needed to be represented.
Exactly. And I also felt that my perspective would give me understanding of other perspectives because I'd been the underdog for so long.
Yeah.
I felt that it gave me the sensitivity and the empathy and the sincerity that it took to be good at this job.
And those are the leaders we need. Empathetic leaders, sensitive leaders.
Lovely final thoughts.
And women who can do this.
Yes.
Women can do it well because we grow up being empathetic and sensitive. All of those qualities that we've been taught were weak are strong qualities that are excellent in leadership.
I don't think we could have had better closing remarks from either of you. Thank you, Representative Gaines, and thank you, Dr. Leroux, for digging into a very complicated subject, but a subject that's so important to us, especially this year in 2020 as we celebrate a century of women's right to vote. And we're entering a year where the vote will be vitally important. Thank you so much. Absolutely. I also want to thank the League of Women Voters of Metro Des Moines who helped partner with us, and they will be out and about making sure that everyone has an opportunity to vote coming up next month and this fall. What a strong organization for women. I'd like to invite you to continue this conversation next month on May 20th, when our speakers, Dr. Rachel Caulfield and Dr. Keshav Scott, will carry on some of the threads of this conversation about women's movements, why they are hard, what goes into them, what are the vital ingredients, how do you create a movement, and how do you build that success. I think we've heard some of the beginnings of that here, learning from history, and we'll now learn from those two women about how we can push forward our agenda. And remember, for all of you who are watching, thank you for joining us today, and especially for those who have been vital in supporting our work. We can't do this work without you. Every dollar you give to Chrysalis goes right back to the community. We've been able to help community members and nonprofits just this spring with COVID-19 closures and challenges, and your help has made that possible. Please, when you're considering a charitable gift, please consider Chrysalis Foundation. We'll put your money to work on behalf of the girls and women in Central Iowa. Thank you all again for being here today. We look forward to seeing you during the month of May. Maybe things will be different, but we'll be delighted to share another Chrysalis Conversations event with you in May. Thank you and have a great day.